everyone, and welcome once again to the Open Mic Writers in Their Own Words, where every show I talk to some really good writers about their work and how they do what they do, navigating the very intense and sometimes very unpredictable publishing industry as it is today. From New York Times bestsellers to sometimes folks who are maybe just getting started in this game, the Open Mic is about and for writers and those interested in the experience of writing and publishing here, as I said, in the modern age. Real quick, for those of you who may not know, the show is available both on YouTube and on all of the major podcast platforms. So you can subscribe to the one that fits your particular needs the best. And yes, that was a subtle hint. Please hit subscribe because it makes it easier for other folks to find the show. And if you wanted to leave me a great review, that'd be awesome too, because that makes it even easier for people to find the show. Not for my benefit, but hopefully for the benefit of folks who want to learn something about writing and publishing from some really, really good, experienced folks who know what they're doing here. Along those lines, my guest today has been called a writer's writer because of the beautiful fluidity of her prose, which is a fancy way of saying that she writes really smart, cool stuff that makes other writers say, damn, I really wish I could write just like her. She's the author of 3 highly acclaimed thrillers, Three Graves Full, which I'm in the midst of right now and loving, Monday's Lie, and The Hidden Things, all of which have earned her frequent comparisons to folks like the Coen brothers and Alfred Hitchcock, among others. I am, of course, talking about the very talented Jamie Mason. Good morning, Jamie, and welcome to the Open Mic. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you. I think we should stop there because I sound really good at that point. So let's
That's
just go
it,
with
folks.
that.
Thank you for joining us today. This has
Right.
been, anyway. Well,
Well,
I recently met Jamie at the Left Coast Crime Writers Conference in Tucson, and that was my first experience with that event, and I really enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to going again when it's in Seattle next year. But it also brings me to my very first question, which is this. Do you consider yourself a thriller writer, a crime writer, a mystery writer, or some combo of all of those things?
I love this is always really interesting because the shelves, the shelving categories are really is fascinating. I'm definitely not a mystery writer because so far I've never written, you always know who done it in my book, but it's more about why done it and now what the hell are they going to do about it, or are they, they can get away with it. So it was funny because I had been saying this for a long time and now I've heard it again and I love it that people are saying I do whydunnits, not whodunnits. So everybody has a little bit of a different definition, right? So for me, in my mind, thriller is always cut the blue wire, with a whole city at stake. I don't write that either. I generally write what I usually call suspense, and it's usually the weirdest thing that's ever happened to some normal person.
I think it's a pretty apt description. And, in the first few pages of your first book, which of course is Three Graves Full, we have a dead body pretty fast. It is not what you expect, though. I'm not going to spoil it for anybody. I'll just say that I having read enough of it now, I completely get what you're saying. I also noted that you are a great writer in the truest sense of the word because you have a really clear, distinct voice that's almost literary in form, but without being boring. And I'm sorry to my friends who write literary work. Did you always want to be a writer, and how did you develop this particular style and the way that you go about the craft?
That's really interesting because it's taken a long time to figure that out. Now, the first question is easy. Did I always want to be a writer? When I was a little kid, people would ask me what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I was a butt kisser. I mean, from the get-go. And I always said a writer. I was always a big reader, but I only said that because adults went, ooh. And I really liked it when adults went, ooh, because they thought that, but it never occurred to me really. And so, but I was always, I loved books, and I was a banker. And I became, so something weird happened to me. I almost had a head-on collision with a cement truck. And everything was fine. We both freaked out in the same direction, or in the correct direction, let's say that. He was in my lane, to be fair, that was not my fault. But Pontiac vibe versus cement truck, I don't think I come out very well on that. And I was super mad, but I was mad for a weird reason. I had been listening to Ventura Highway by the group America. And I was super angry because my last living thought was going to be alligator lizards in the air. And I was deeply offended by this. And for some reason, it made me go home and write a scene where a woman experiences this and she doesn't survive. And so the whole thing is from a ghostly point of view. And she becomes, she haunts the Good Samaritan who tried to save her. Not on purpose, she just actually just follows him. So that ended up, I realized I loved composing fiction. The people at the bank used to tell me I wrote the best memos and I should be a writer. But yeah, so I thought I would try. As far as the style goes, I love English. I grew up, my father was a preacher, so we grew up with the King James Bible, and it was very melodic and beautifully written. So I don't know where the style came from, except I do think English is unbelievably rich, so you can play around and say things in unusual ways. And there's so many words for the same thing, but they all have little connotations, and I do enjoy playing around with that. So thanks for liking it. I think some people find it a bit dense.
Well, so now I have to follow up and ask what happened to the first manuscript, because every writer I know says, "Oh, I've got 2 or 3, 4 or 10 or 20 that were sitting in a drawer somewhere and never see the light of day again." What happened to yours?
Exactly. So I wrote. My sister ended up. I read it to her on the phone, and a month later she said, "Hey, did you read it? Did you write any more of that?" And all of a sudden, I got this idea for a whole plot. And what's funny is I still love that story. I had no idea what I was doing. And so I queried it. And between that and a short story I wrote, I garnered about 100 rejections. I think I just crested into 3-digit rejections. But in the meantime, I did start what became 3 Graves Full. And so that one, yeah, that one's probably never going to see the light of day. It's a fun story, but.
Like I say, every writer I know has at least one, and many have more than that, before something actually works. I mean, that's the thing they don't tell you about writing. If you want to write a book, right? The thing they don't tell you is that, the process, everybody, I think a lot of people, when they first do this thing, I'm going to write this book and I'm going to get an agent and it's going to go to HarperCollins, and then they'll do movie rights. And, I'm going to get limo rides around to the Today Show and all these things. And, because I'm super talented and that's all the industry cares about, and on and on. And then later on, when you find out no one gives a rat's about any of your stuff, and that's never going to happen. Your agents hate you, and it takes a long time to get a smidgen of any of that to happen. And in the meantime, it's a long self-guided course through misery, rejection, and being slapped down by even people that you think should love you.
No, I mean, this endeavor has about 10,000 ways to make you feel like an idiot. And so it's weird, I think, opportunity, which I didn't understand. And so I try to appreciate it for personal growth, to be able to figure out what to do with the disappointment or the distraction. That's my big thing. And to let go of your expectations, because you'll drive yourself crazy.
Well, yeah, and I guess that's in a way, maybe you've already answered this, but rejection is such a big part of this business. You mentioned that first story, maybe short stories. How did you learn to handle rejection in a positive way?
I don't know. I guess the thing I cultivated for both rejection and negative reviews, I am somebody who likes to read reviews. And a lot of people recommend writers not do that, and I totally understand it. But for me, it's part of the experience, the whole putting it out there. And I realized that I hate a lot of things. I don't I don't like a lot of things. I invest at least my time, if not my time and my money, and end up not particularly happy about this. It didn't agree with me. And I'm totally comfortable with that. It's just the way the world is. So I have to be totally comfortable with people receiving my work. Maybe it's not to their taste. Maybe they intersected it at the wrong time. It's just the way it is. And that's the way it is for me with other things, from food to film that I take in. And so some of it's luck. And then when you reach people who do like it, it's amazing. It's like a time machine. They have the same experience, or at least a similar experience in their head that you did when you wrote it, and it's magic. And if you can manage to stick it out and get lucky and find a groove, it's wonderful, and you can't control that. And so it's made me more relaxed. It's made me more zen, I think.
Well, and it is true. You cannot make everybody happy. It really does not matter what it is. You could give some people $1 million in gold bullion and they'd complain you didn't give them 2 million. I mean, it's just how it is. But it is so very hard as a creative person, because you put your heart and soul into something, and you're building it from out of nothing, out of whole cloth, or maybe whatever the inspiration was. But the thing you're building is yours. And I think we all want people to go, God, you're brilliant. That's the best thing I've ever read. And then when it's not that, or worse, they say it's the worst thing they've ever read. I think it's really hard for some people to compartmentalize it in a positive way and then move on, so that they can keep creating and keep honing. And it sounds like you found a way to do that.
I did. And you know what helped? When Three Bears Full came out, what's weird is it happened with 3 different passages, and I don't remember what the passages were, but different reviewers from around the country. And I think some of these were reader reviews, some of these were newspaper type reviews, or librarian reviews. 3 different quotes were picked out of the book by 6 people who didn't know each other. Each of them used by one as an example of why I was a genius. The same quote being tagged for why I should have, and I'm sort of quoting here or paraphrasing from close memory, that I should have my typing fingers removed so that I never committed such an offense against the English language ever again. Same quote, right? And it happened with 3 different quotes and 6 different reviewers. So the fact that some people thought it was great, apparently those are the ones I connect with on a mental, an emotional level, and the ones didn't. That's just the way it is. So whatever.
Do you ever interact with certainly I know at a conference or something you might interact with people in person, but do you ever interact with people online? Do you ever answer when they say something to you, or do you
not negative ones? I do find it strange when people write a negative review and they have to make sure I saw it, like they tag me in, or contact me and make sure how much they know, how I know that they didn't like it. That's a strange take, because I don't resent that they want to tell the world they didn't like it. I just don't know why they need to tell me. If anybody reaches out with a question or a comment that's positive, I always try to respond, because I'm not that well known, so it's not like I get deluged with mail. But yeah, I've interacted with a lot of. In fact, I've become friends with a couple of people who had contacted me about the book, so that's fun.
That's interesting. Well, just to what you're saying, that always feels to me like a level of narcissism, that somebody has to be sure you saw their very, very important opinion.
Right.
Because your life cannot go forward unless you know what they think.
Yeah, it's kind of an odd. It's an odd thing to do, because I never resent things that don't go well, but I never take it as that they want me to feel bad personally, but occasionally that does not seem to be true.
Yeah. Well, we live in strange times. Now regular listeners of the show, viewers of the show, have heard me ask this question before, because of course when you talk with crime writers, and a lot of them tend to be cops or tend to have come from high intensity fields, you haven't, but still, you really have a great dark sense of humor in your writing, which I really appreciate. I always, again, I apologize to anyone who's heard me say this before. My brother was a cop. I've had friends who were firemen and, emergency room personnel, things like that. And the thing that they all have in common, almost fully across the board, is a very dark sense of humor, which I've always taken as a complete coping mechanism, right? Because when you see horrible stuff all the time, I mean, what else can you do but find a way to lighten the mood somehow, right? Of course, you didn't come from that background, but you still have a really interesting and dark and a little bit of a macabre sense of humor, which again, clearly I like it. Give me some perspective on your use of humor in your writing. Is it an intentional thing, or is it part of your natural voice that just comes through in how you tell stories?
I think it's a little of both. For some reason, it's weird because it's usually often physical pain. I'm one of those people, like if I bang my kneecap or something, I have a tendency to laugh because it's ridiculous how much certain things hurt. Like there's no evolutionary benefit for it to be that painful to, bust your toe. So I find it kind of funny. It's incongruously painful. And so I have a tendency to laugh at these things because out of pure appreciation for that's ridiculous. And I always remember I was a big Stephen King fan, still am. And he would do these things in the middle of terrible things. I felt it was very realistic that a character might think something ridiculous or notice something ridiculous, because sometimes we do in the middle of awful things. Plus, I think crime fiction is amazing for bringing interesting people do interesting things when things go wrong, and that's often funny. It's all the squirrel in the intersection. It runs and it goes back and it can't make a decision, so it ends up being weirdly comical. So I do press on that almost more for realism than for humor, because to me it's the way it feels to think about these things. But yeah, I do enjoy the humor part, although apparently I'm really gross and I didn't realize I was quite that gross.
Well, I haven't got to that yet.
Oh, I'll expect an email from you when you do.
Okay.
You'll be like,
Let's
ooh, now I
go.
see what you mean.
Yeah. You know, every writer has their own approach to structure, and with a lot of thriller writers, their emphasis is on plot. At first, characters maybe secondary. Other writers, of course, it's exactly the opposite way. They'll go character, and the plot is almost ancillary to what it is they're doing. What's your approach to this? Are you a plot over character person, or other way around?
It's funny, people assume the other way. I'm definitely a plot over character, but only in that it has to make sense. Unlike real life, when you write it down, there has to be a reason. You have to be able to answer the why. So the way it usually works for me is that I get enamored of a bizarre situation, and then I try to think, okay, who would find themselves in this predicament? And so I sort of retrofit what feels to me at the time the most interesting person to have this problem. And then whenever I can, I say, okay, well, how can it be worse? At least for the start, to really put them in a tight spot. But I usually invent the person for the problem.
Interesting. You mentioned earlier that you write whydunnits, not whodunnits. So, which at Left Coast, that's the first time I'd heard that expression. I said, "Oh, that's a really interesting way to think about this." Has that always been the focal point of what you're doing? I mean, did you consciously say, I don't want to write a mystery. I don't, I want to more address the psychology behind somebody doing the things they do. Was that always the point of when you started out doing this?
Always. So yeah, I had a strange upbringing, a little bit sheltered, and I just wanted to know why people did things. Why? It was very soothing to me to try to make sense of stuff as best I can. You can't always understand exactly why. So I became fascinated by psychology, and I actually have a copy of the DSM that I read the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illnesses and Personality Disorders. I read it like a novel because I'm very interested in that. So yeah, why putting together a satisfying, at least for me, answer to the question, why would somebody do this, and then why would they do this in reaction to that, is fun for me, and it feels like an opportunity to learn. I think so. Yeah, that's why I've always loved that.
It's very much more like my daughter. My daughter was the same way. She going all the way back to junior high school. She always said, "Oh, she wanted to work with the criminal mind," and just fascinated by how people think and what they do. And of course, she did end up going into psychology, and she worked in a jail situation for a long time as a mental health expert, and she's not doing that now. But certainly, it seems like if you have that bug, it's something you're going to keep with you. So aspiring writers are always told to read what you write, right? That's the whole thing. Read a lot, but read the thing that you want to write. What does your reading list look like? First of all, does that apply to you? Number one, which it sounds like maybe it might, but then what does your reading list look like? Who are the folks that you like to read?
Well, yeah, so I refined that. I do think it's good for aspiring writers to occasionally finish a book they don't like, because sometimes knowing what you don't want to do is pretty important. It's great to have an example of that. But I've gotten to the point, I used to be the person who would, if I started a book, I had to finish it. I'm not that person anymore. And in fact, I do not read jacket copies at all anymore. I don't care what the book is about. It doesn't matter. I just want to read the page, and you can tell me what there are no topics that are off limits for me. So I just want to keep me reading. I don't care if it's science fiction. I don't care if it's literary. I don't care if it's a crime fiction. Whatever your story is, it's just how you tell it. And so I really find it important these days to fill my head with writing I love. And so as soon as I start losing interest, I give them about 10 pages to get it back on track. And if I don't get back on track, I just stop. And so I found it really valuable after doing this for a while to just fill my head with the sound of prose that I like, that I respond to.
I really appreciate and respect that perspective on writing, but in all things. I'm a reporter by trade, and I've got a couple of interns that I'm shepherding right now, and one of the things, because I cover the California State Capitol, and so I'm always trying to teach them things that I know they're not going to learn in a classroom, right? Because there's just so much stuff that you just can't learn unless you go out and do it, right? And so I take them to every kind of press conference and event, and I introduce them to all these different kinds of people. And the thing I'm always trying to reinforce them is, you never know what you're going to learn, and especially from somebody you think you don't have any interest in learning anything from. That is the number one thing in doing this job, is you have to be relentlessly curious, and especially about things that maybe you don't know anything about. And it really feels the same thing with writers, right? You never know where you might see a great turn of a phrase, or hear something interesting, or learn something that will benefit what you want to write, even if it's something completely different from your genre.
Absolutely.
And I hear that's why it frustrates me a little bit when I hear something that all they ever read is mysteries. Okay.
Yeah. And
it's fine.
One of the hardest things too, and I find that harder to square with writers, but that is true. But people read for different reasons too. I mean, the reason, there are people who read 1 or 2 books a week. That's impossible for me. I read very slowly. I'm a savorer, and that's one of the reasons I think my style. I write to the speed that I read, and so I read very deliberately and slowly because I want to take it all in. But clearly, other people get what they want out of reading at an amazing pace. And I don't know what that feels like. Some people like reading the same type of story over and over again, and it scratches an itch for them. I don't know what it is, but that's another way to feel okay about, or maybe not okay, but better about your work not appealing in certain places, because people are just reading for different things.
Right. I noted earlier the comparisons to Hitchcock and the Coen brothers, other authors like Gillian Flynn. How do those comparisons have impact on you, or do they? And is there anything subconscious when you hear those things? Is there anything subconscious that you then have to make conscious and say, okay, don't do this, or what have you? You know, do you have to go back and rethink something because, oh, you know, I let that comparison get to me? You know, is that ever happened to you?
No, but I think it's because I love, most of the comparisons, maybe I get just a whiff of why that might be true. So I don't know exactly what somebody saw in my work that made them say that. But almost always I've enjoyed the comparison, even if I don't quite understand it. Like the Coen brothers, there are a couple of things, the dark humor, and sometimes things becoming a little absurd in that when it rains it pours type problems. It's general enough that it won't make me do anything specific, so I haven't had that problem. And that's so far it's only felt like encouragement, so I've loved it.
Okay, you have a rare condition called, and I hope I'm saying this right, aphantasia, which means you don't see images in your mind, no little mental pictures and movie reels playing in your head, which I unfortunately have all the time. But how has that impacted you as a writer?
So it's amazing, right? I didn't realize, so the term, if I'm not mistaken, wasn't coined until about 2015. Both sides, so as far as they understand it, aphantasics are less than 3% of the population, could be around 1%, but I also think there's a scale of people with no mental pictures in their, it's an invention and memory. Everyone dreams in pictures. So that's not affected. Everybody thought each other were speaking metaphorically. Like I still use the language of I can just picture that, or I can just see her doing this thing in my head. And I thought everybody was being metaphorical. So I don't know what it would be like to have images. So it's hard to say how it affected me. I mean, what's funny about it is that I process, in fact, I'm a visual learner. I process things normally, visually, but it turns into something else. As soon as I've taken it in, it never becomes a picture. I didn't know that other people had that happen. And it's funny because I'll have people say, oh, I can even see where something is on a page. Like if I remember what I was reading. Well, actually, I do that too. Like I remember that it was in the upper left corner of a page, but I don't have an image. I don't have anything that feels like vision when I do it. So I don't know how it's different. I know that I can just, even the tests for aphantasia can be kind of silly. They say, describe a sunset. Well, I have no problem describing a sunset, describe a sunset on the ocean. I can do it. I know what it looks like. I'm just not seeing it when I do it. My husband's face, I know what my husband looks like. One of the tests for aphantasia was, the doctor said aphantasics would have a hard time knowing how many windows they have in their house. And I'm like, what do you think my life is like, that I walk into a room and go, holy shit, windows. I know where all my windows are. I know I know how many I have. It's just turns in, the way I liken it is like it's a code, like the Matrix. I know what these things are. I just don't see them. So I'm not quite sure how it would be different. Only in that when you read a novel, do you kind of make an image when you read it?
Yeah, I think I do.
Yeah. I don't know what
I
that's
do.
like. But
Well, I do it more when I write. than I do when I read. At least I think I do. I don't know. Maybe I'm not that conscious of it. Maybe that's the thing. Maybe so
Yeah,
much of what we're talking about is unconscious stuff.
right, right. When you really think about it, I mean, you'll have people who very much feel like they experience something very similar to regular vision when they're thinking or remembering things. But then when other people really think about it, like my daughter was like, wait a minute. When she really thought about it, there was a difference between looking at something and remembering something. It's one of these things that will be very difficult to know how similar or different we are. What they've been able to find when they put people in functional MRIs is that for somebody like me, when I'm asked to remember something, my visual cortex isn't going to light up, but my linguistic and memory will light up, but not my visual cortex.
Interesting. Well, and one of the reasons that was such an interesting question to me, one of the authors that was on the show recently is dyslexic, had to overcome that, and as such, he's a very visual learner. He needs to be able to visualize things very clearly in his mind to be able to process it. So it's just funny that with you, it's exactly the opposite thing.
Exactly. Right.
So there's a really cool origin story for your third book, Hidden Things. Can you share that with us?
The hidden things, it was kind of fun, and remind me if I'm not saying the part that that you're looking for. For me, it started with a video that I had seen years earlier of a girl being attacked in a foyer from her home, in her home, and she gets away. It's an alarming video. It was it was a crime, but she was ultimately physically fine. But I became curious why these people had a video camera in their foyer. Like, I understand outside cameras and things like that, but I thought it was kind of interesting choice. So when it was time to write a new book, I thought, that came up, and I thought, well, what if a video like that went viral and there was something in the video nobody was supposed to see? And then I ended up marrying that with the idea of the art heist at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. The Gardner Museum, I want to say 1990. Now it's been so long since I've looked at it. It was the largest theft of personal property in the history of personal property, and about $550 million worth of artwork was stolen. They tied up the guards, and so one of the paintings is the MacGuffin in that book. One of the lesser paintings that they would have thought it was a Rembrandt. When Isabella Stewart Gardner bought it, she almost certainly thought it was a Rembrandt. It's not, and the painting wouldn't have been worth much, except that now it's the part of one of the most famous art heists in history. So that's where all that came from. Is that what we were talking about?
Absolutely. And because when I first read that, I thought, oh wow, see, again, a question I never ask writers, because I've been told by enough of them that they hate this question, and I completely understand why, is where do you come up with your ideas? Well, people ask me that sometimes too, as a reporter, not as a writer, and I was, it's called the news. Have you heard of it? I mean, there's stuff all around you. Pay attention. If you're a creative person, there's almost anything can be turned into a good yarn if you are so inclined, right? It's not like there's the big book of ideas that you open and go, hey,
No.
I mean, that may be writing prompts or something. I guess I know, understand that, but for the most part, I love it when writers can take an idea or just an incident or just something that, again, seems completely unrelated to maybe what they might, have going on in their life or whatever, and they can really work a great story out of it. So that's why I said I wanted you to tell that story.
No, sometimes I don't mind the question, especially coming from non-writers. It makes perfect sense why they would ask that question. I don't find it irritating or offensive. It's only that it's often mysterious, and if I try to explain it, I just sound like a crazy person. And so it's one of these things that the question sounds completely reasonable, but the answer is going to sound bonkers sometimes. So that one has an answer, but it is hard. It can be quite mysterious. Where, I mean, for my second book, I was falling asleep and a line came to me, was my mother told me never to marry a man, never keep a man for more years than I had fingers. And the joke was that the mother is missing 2 fingers from her left hand. Where did that come from? I have no idea. So you end up sounding a little schizophrenic when you say these things. And so sometimes I think the discomfort in the question is that if you tried to put words on it, you sound like a crazy person.
That's a perfectly reasonable response too. Um, I read that you tend to edit as you go rather than just, brain dumping a draft and then going back. And of course, that's one of those things that we're always told, don't do that, right? Just get it all down, then you go back and edit. Don't edit as you go. Which makes me, the real question here is rules, right? That's one of the things too that writers always told. There's all these rules. Oh, prologues are out. Don't include a prologue. I had an agent tell me one time, oh, if I don't have a dead body in the first 2 or 3 pages, I stop reading. Just there's all these rules, things that thou shall or thou shalt not in writing. What do you think about that? Because the reason I asked too is I've read that and I've tried to adhere to those, and then I'll read somebody like Don Winslow, who doesn't adhere to any of these rules. He does whatever, and he's one of the greatest crime fiction writers that's ever lived, right? Or Elmore Leonard, or any of these folks, right? You read them and you go, they're not following any of these rules. What's your thought on the rules, right?
Really interesting that you asked me that, because the last couple of years since the pandemic, I had a really hard time writing. My brain was so bungled with the news and the weirdness of the world, and I was having such a hard time writing. But I work with some wonderful writers in my writing group, and so instead I was pressing on this idea of the rules and where does this come from? Because when I started, I didn't know there was anybody. I didn't know anybody had any rules, and so all I tried to do was write something that reminded me, that would be sort of like books that I had liked, that it would make me feel the same way, that I would read it and try to say, okay, does that seem like the same type of effect? And for me, when I found out that the most often advised to just run for the end and fix it later, I couldn't imagine doing that, because I never know if a story's going to work. In the pandemic, I had to throw out 2 books because it wasn't working. I never know it's going to work until I get to the end the first time. And so it's usually chapter by chapter or scene by scene. If I can polish that up and make it make sense, it sounds like the way I want it to sound, and I'm happy with it, it's kind of an atta girl. It's a high five to myself. Okay, you can keep going. Now, so by the time I get to the end, it takes me forever, but it's pretty close to what it's going to look like when I turn it in. Now, that doesn't mean for a second that I'm not going to change my mind about something while I'm writing and then have to go back and make adjustments, or when an editor says we need more of this or less of that, or I don't understand this, you're going to have to go in and make adjustments. But to be completely satisfied with it at any point that I am, it's what gives me the strength, and it gives me the encouragement to keep going. So really, I guess the rules would only be whatever gets you to the end. I couldn't get to the end knowing I was dragging this big wake of destruction that I had to fix. And I wouldn't want to get to the end and go, okay, well, now I have to go in and make it make sense, because you would have, for me, I would have committed to a path that didn't make sense, and I'd have to pull so many stitches to get out that I'd just be rewriting the book anyway.
Right. Interesting. So Hidden Things came out a few years ago. When can we expect to see a new Jamie Mason novel?
Well, like I said, unfortunately, I started 2 books that didn't work in the pandemic, but now I'm writing something that I feel is much more likely to work. So it's April. I'd love to be done with the draft in the summertime. And then I guess we'll see what my agent says, because I've had single book contracts. I didn't have a long contract. So yeah, I'm in the same boat as everybody would be in, to just have to see if I get somebody who wants to do anything with it. So
It's another one of those things that folks think you get an agent and they're your agent for life and they rep you on every single thing you do, and that's just how it is. And man, that does work sometimes, but so often, no, it doesn't. No,
And my agent and she looks at my stuff as I go, so I wouldn't get too far down the path. I mean, it's not that I couldn't envision writing something that somebody else would be an agent for, but right now I only write things that she would want to represent. So we have that relationship, which is great.
That is good. My agent is rep my nonfiction stuff, but he doesn't do any fiction. So yeah,
Right.
not helpful at all.
No, no. If ever I wrote nonfiction, I might end up in that way. And it's funny because I love to read nonfiction. I have not yet tried my hand at it. Maybe someday.
Well, and it's one of those things we tend to think agents rep books. Well, they have very specific things that they like themselves. I mean, it's understandable, right? They need to feel comfortable about something to be able to go out and represent it and try to sell it for you. And if you're writing YA and they don't read YA
Exactly.
or whatever, if they don't rep
kids
that
books or self-help, your agent may not do any of that stuff.
Yeah, so you're probably better off not having that agent if they don't do those things. So
exactly.
Anyway, I always like to end our show on what I hope is a fun question. I mean for it to be a fun question. And so the way it works is I'm going to give you the names of three people. Let's just say I have this magical, mystical power. I can put you together with any one of these three people for whatever, dinner, drinks, long walk, doesn't matter.
Okay.
You guys can have the greatest conversation ever, but you can pick only one of the following three people.
Okay, great.
The options that I'm going to give you today are the great Formula One driver Michael Schumacher, the owner of the Washington Commanders, at least now, Daniel Snyder, and the great legendary Katharine Hepburn. You can pick one of those three to have a great conversation with. Who are you picking and why?
The conversation with Dan Snyder would be really short because I'd just kick him in the shins and run away. So, that's tough. I'm going to go with Katharine Hepburn. Michael Schumacher would have been amazing to speak to, but Formula One drivers are very they're like surgeons that can do math with their butts. They probably would be able. Yeah, I probably wouldn't understand a word he was saying. So yeah, I think Katharine Hepburn would be fantastic to talk to.
There you go. I love her too. I absolutely love her. Well, Jamie, thank you very much. I really appreciate you coming on the show today. I look forward to actually now I'm going to be one of those people. Now that I've discovered your writing, I'm gonna be one of those people who goes and reads everything that you've written. And I highly recommend all you out there too. If you haven't discovered Jamie Mason's books, I highly recommend that you go check her out because she's really talented.
Thank you.
Saying, for all of us here at the open mic, which is me and my two hounds behind me, my guest Jamie Mason. I will remind you one more time, if you haven't hit subscribe, please do so. It really does help other folks find the show. You can go out and spend a ton of money on craft books to learn about writing, or you can watch this show for free and you can learn a lot from people who are really, really good at it. And they're probably a lot more interesting than reading craft books. But not to dump on craft books. Hey man,
no,
I don't do any of that either. The last thing I will leave y'all with is the same thing I leave you with every week, which is tomorrow is not promised to any of us. So please make today count. Until next time, I'm Rich Eisen. This has been the open mic for myself, my guest, Jamie Mason. Take care, and we will see you next time.